We are kicking off the first of our Politics and the Internet seminar series this term with a speaker. I'm really delighted to get to the OI to speak. We have had you here on several occasions. In fact, you've been launching your own research programmes, I gather, recently, which we're keen to learn more about from you. It is interesting to me, though, to have you here in this context today, because I first met you many, many years ago when I was a postgraduate and I was doing some casual tutoring. You were doing a PPE degree. And since then, you have gone on to achieve such an enormous amount, but as we might come to discuss in a minute, not necessarily as a result of the PPE degree, so we'll come back to that question. Maybe let's start with what you've been doing, though. So you are founder and director of My Society. Could you tell me a little bit about what that is and what gave you the idea to start that?
So My Society is a social enterprise. It's a charity, also does bits of commercial work for people, but it's mainly a charity. The reason that it exists is to use the internet to build tools or to supply tools to members of the public that help those fairly normal citizens to exert power over decision makers and institutions in different ways. And power is really sort of like the key word in our mission. The mechanisms sometimes vary. Sometimes it's exerting power by getting information out in a form of transparency. Sometimes it's exerting power just by asking questions politely. Please, would you do this? Please, would you help me? And so we run a variety of websites like that. And increasingly these days, My Society primarily actually works by helping people to run websites that have the same role and the same function in countries around the world.
What made you think it was needed? How did you spot a gap?
So we started at the very end of 2003, so it's more than 10 years ago now. And I would say that the way that we spotted the gap was in that classic fashion that it just seemed sort of rather obvious. And in particular, it seemed obvious for the following reason, which is 2003 is not prehistoric in internet terms. Quite a lot of things already existed. Yeah. You could buy a pair of shoes on the internet quite successfully. You could find yourself a date on the internet. You could achieve a huge number of very tangible things. You could book a holiday. You could buy an airline ticket. You could do any number of things. But if you were wondering what you could do in the civic or the democratic realm of your life that was tangible in that way, tangible in the way of like, I go to the website and then a pair of shoes comes in a box to my house, there wasn't much there. You could give some money to political campaigns or to the Red Cross or somebody, but there weren't many sites where you, as it were, could sort of pull a lever and something would come out. That seemed like a discrepancy. That seemed unusual, and so we set out to build services that had that sort of rather transactional feel. I go there. I'm not just going to read some material. I'm going to use it like a machine or like a tool, and then it's going to help me in some way. And so it was merely seeing everything else happening, the rest of the internet, and going, why isn't this really happening in the political, democratic, civil society realm?
So, I mean, you were obviously trying to fill a gap that you saw. You were trying to give people a chance to actually physically make a difference. As you say, it wasn't just about giving them more information. How do you, on that basis, how do you measure your success? So, what criteria do you use? What evaluations do you use?
Yeah, so this has been a real kind of conceptual problem, especially by the standards of a university like this, for a long, long time. There is one way that you can measure achievement in the general, what I would now call sort of civic social innovation, civic technology field, which is really unambiguous, and it's the only way that's unambiguous, which is if nobody shows up, if nobody uses the thing you do, then you failed, right? Yeah. So there is one form of evaluation which is conceptually very simple and has some value, and it especially has value in a sector in which, unfortunately, quite a lot of things do launch and then nobody uses them. So that's one form of output. Unfortunately, the moment a service is any bigger than zero, there are some people using it. It could be a few, could be a lot, could be millions. The frameworks that we have, the conceptual frameworks to know whether that really matters, are really, really weak at the moment. And you mentioned before that we are just beginning a program of research collaborations with universities around the world. That is, in the very, very first thing that we need to sort of force there is a public debate on how do you know, if you run a website that helps people, for example, report the fact that they have paid bribes. It's not the kind of website that my organisation runs, but there are people in our sector who do it. let's say you run it for a year. You run it in India. 10,000 people report that they paid 10,000 bribes and they leave some information. What is the right conceptual framework to assess whether or not that was a good project or not? Because it is nothing like the world of philanthropy around medicine or disease and so on, where it's like, well, we gave 10,000 malaria nets and then we did a study and it turned out that 2,000 children didn't get malaria who might have otherwise, We're in the Victorian era of medicine in terms of like how good our conceptual frameworks are. We sort of know there should be some evidence. We sort of know that we're trying to do good things, and yet we don't we know about as much about the success in our field as I would argue that a Victorian medical expert would have known about medicine.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning that there is at least this very blunt measure, which is, do people use it? And clearly you do have immense traction. You have large numbers of users. You also have a lot of demand, as you said, internationally for other organisations who want to use and provide the same sort of tools as you developed. And that sort of suggests to me that at least if we look at some of the citizenry, they do have the skills to engage digitally with these sorts of issues. But you're here today to talk a little bit about the other side of it, which is policymakers, civil servants engaging in return. How effective do you think that has been, and do you think there is a skills gap?
So I'm not specifically here today to talk about policymakers and sort of citizen engagement and democratic questions. I'm really more here. I'm going to be talking about really whether our leaders, both political leaders and sort of civil service leaders and so on, fundamentally whether they understand the modern world as it relates to digital technologies and all sorts. So some of that is, do they understand the options for getting information out of citizens in order to understand what do those citizens want? Can they, as it were, can they see options beyond having a vote or having a renting a village hall and asking people? Do they understand? Are they familiar with the array of tools that you might now use in order to understand what a group of people want? But that question of, do the decision makers essentially know about the technologies, know about the implications, that extends into a lot of areas that are really about the non-democratic parts of governance. Just, can they build a hospital? Can they build a railway? Can they choose a tax policy that's appropriate today? And my concern and the sort of the theme today is really going to be about can you make good tax policy, for example, if you don't really understand very much about the things that are different about a world that's highly digitally mediated and a world that isn't?
I mean, we obviously would be quite strong advocates, I think, of that position. It's one of the things we aim to do here through our masters and our PhD courses. But, just for my benefit, what sort of things would you like to see us teaching people then to make them more digitally literate in this way?
So one of the very first ones in some ways is to help develop almost what a curriculum is in terms of what the leaders need to know. Yeah. Quite often there's a unfortunate sort of reductivist tendency to say computing is fundamentally about computer programming. Therefore, if we're going to teach anyone, whether it's a 5-year-old or the Prime Minister, about digital, we need to teach them to program. Sort of seductive argument, but actually it's kind of it's not really true in many ways. There's a massive spectrum of knowledge between what it means to write a very simple computer program and what it means to sign off a contract for a gigantic health technology project. So one of the first things that an academic institution like this can help work out is, of everything that one can know about computers, which is a lot, what is the little subset? What is the 5% that we need to pull out and say that really matters for decision makers, versus maybe the 95%, knowing about pointers or NAND gates or whatever, all these computing concepts that are fundamental to people who work in computing, but that don't really affect your ability to make high-level decisions. So the number one thing would be to work out which bits they need to be taught. But then if I was to sort of pick a favorite piece, it would probably be around the basics of how data behaves, how it moves around, how it leaks private information, when it doesn't leak private information, and that sort of thing. Sort of a bit like teaching people teaching an engineer about the basics of water, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you know, it's the 100th anniversary, I gather, of PPE this year, so maybe this will help set the agenda for the next 200.
Okay.
But look forward to hearing more later. Tom, thank you so much indeed.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.